Thank you, Stephanie, and thank all of you for coming. And just to piggyback off what Stephanie was saying about buying from local independent bookstores, I think at the heart of what she's saying is, hey, we pay taxes, but we also want to shoot a rocket into outer space and live in zero gravity like Jeff Bezos for a little bit. So please buy your books from independent bookstores so these booksellers can travel at outer space. James is over there laughing. You can use that, James, if you want on stage. It's a thrill to be here. I was walking here and I always forget what a destination Asheville is. And I've decided that if writing books doesn't work out for me, I'm going to get a job in downtown Asheville and get paid to ask folks, what are y'all looking for? I think that would be one of the most successful businesses I could be in this town. I want to introduce John before I talk a little bit about the Wilma Dykeman Writer-in-Residence that he is part of this summer. And then we'll talk about writing. Imagine we have some writers in the audience. I know we have some writers in the audience because I know some of you. So we'll talk a little bit about craft. We'll talk about maybe agents a little bit. If you have questions about that kind of stuff, please ask us those questions. These are great venues to ask those kinds of questions in. John Vercher lives in the Philadelphia area with his wife and 2 sons. Shout out to Philadelphia.
Right.
Yeah. He has a bachelor's in English from the University of Pittsburgh and an MFA in creative writing from the Mountain View Master of Fine Arts program. He is a contributing writer for WBUR Boston's Cognoscenti, and NPR features his essays on race, identity, and parenting. His debut novel, 3/5, was named one of the best books of the year by the Chicago Tribune, Crime Reads, and Booklist. It was nominated for the Edgar Award, the Anthony Award, and Strand Magazine Critics Awards for Best First Novel. His follow-up novel, After the Lights Go Out, received rave reviews from the New York Times, National Public Radio, and starred reviews from Booklist and Publishers Weekly. It was named a Booklist Editor's Choice Best Book of the Year, a Book Riot Best Book of the Summer, and one of Publishers Weekly's Best Books of the Summer. John Vercher. But as wonderful as all of that is, most importantly for our purposes this evening is that John is currently serving as UNC Asheville's inaugural Wilma Dykeman Writer-in-Residence. And what that means is he's spending a month at the Dykeman homestead up in Beaver Dam, where he's at work on a new novel. And in his spare time, he's interacting with UNC Asheville's writing students and members of the Asheville writing community. The Wilma Dykeman Writer-in-Residence would not have come to fruition without the support and kindness of Ellen Carr and the visionary leadership of Jim and Ann Stokely, who are here with us today. Nor would it, Nor would it have happened without the hard work of the committee and the group of writers who joined me in wading through an overwhelming amount of applications to choose John Vercher. And the applications were magnificent. I think we had several dozen applications and they were all just really wonderful. It was a tough decision to make. I want to take a moment to thank Erica Abrams-Locklear, Laura Lagrone, Kirk Swinson, and members of the selection committee, Mildred Baria, Elizabeth Kostafa, Annette Sanuk-Clapsaddle, and Susan Andrew. I especially want to thank Ellen Pearson for her leadership and dedication to tying so many loose ends together to bring this project home. She came in exactly the right time. We are coming close to announcing the recipient of the spring residency, but for now, I want to spend this evening honoring John, someone who has been, as we all knew he would be, an ideal inaugural resident. So thank you, John.
Thank you.
So starting off tonight, your most recent book, When the Lights Go Out, or After the Lights Go Out. When the Lights Go Out should have been, that's a sexier title. Like what does happen when the lights go out? No. Can you tell us a little bit about this novel?
Sure. So it is about a mixed race, mixed martial arts fighter who's on the wrong side of 30 on the tail end of his career, and unbeknownst to all but the closest to him, he's losing his battle with CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It's manifesting in memory loss, sort of uncontrolled bouts of rage, and he's dealing with all this while his white father is suffering from end-stage Alzheimer's. And as he's caring for his father, he's starting to realize that his father's maybe not the man he thought he was, and starting to have those own realizations about himself.
That's a great summary. I want to say that when I teach writing, I tell students to make sure of two things. For those of you who are writers, maybe keep this in mind as well. I tell students to keep two things in mind concerning their main characters. First, don't ever make your characters orphans. And second, do not make them angels. Do not make your main characters orphans, and do not make your main characters angels. The reason why you don't want them to be orphans is because they're not accountable to anybody. Nobody's relying on them. We don't see them managing, navigating relationships. And so we don't know anything about their emotional landscapes. And the reason you don't make them angels is because angels aren't interesting. All right? If tonight God and Satan were like, we're going out tonight, who wants to go with whom? You'd be like, Satan? How many seats can you fit at that table? And how long are we going out? Complex characters are just more interesting. And John, you do a great job of not making Xavier an orphan, and he's certainly not an angel. Can you talk about all of the relationships in his life and the people that are depending on him from his father? You mentioned his father, Sam. He's got a dog for a little bit. He's got his cousin Shot. So the people who are depending on him, and then also how you went in there and made sure he wasn't just a guy that you felt bad for all the time.
I think the driving factor behind that was one, this idea that angels are uninteresting. But I think there's always sort of this temptation, at least I think for me, when writing about issues of race and identity, to make the character flawless, right? Because I want it to be this representation of who I want other people to think about when they think about people outside of their race, or people, that come from marginalized communities. But that wouldn't be honest and truthful if I was writing characters that weren't flawed in that way. And so it was a really very conscious choice to make sure that he had challenges of his own, and that he performed actions within the book that made you go, maybe I'm not so sure about this guy.
Can you talk about some of the complications in his past, maybe some of the decisions he's made, or some of the ways he's disappointed people in his past?
Yeah, I think specifically, hopefully without giving out too much away, although you should have all read it, is the decisions he made about his mother when she left. His mother decided to leave because of the actions of his father, but he spent so much time with his father that he had made him an angel, and decided that she had to be wrong. He was going to separate from her in all ways as soon as he was able when he turned 18. And age has given him the ability to reflect and say, maybe that was the wrong call.
And also some of the things that he's learning about his father.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We just have someone over here who's having a little trouble hearing. So I don't know, John, if you're able to speak up, or I can grab you the mic.
Yeah.
Wiley, you remember how this worked, right? Just pass on that.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Okay.
Is that better? Okay, great. I thought I projected.
I think it's the air conditioning is on over on this side, so just make it.
Got it. Sorry about that, guys. I'm sorry.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about him not being an angel, maybe, and some of the things he might have done in his professional life, and some of the ways he's disappointed, maybe Shot, or some of the pressures that are coming to bear on him?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you can disappoint Shot. Shot's not an easy guy to disappoint. But I think Xavier in a lot of ways disappoints himself. But he hasn't been honest with himself about how he's disappointed himself. And I think particularly that comes down to his decision to use performance enhancing drugs to advance himself as a fighter. A lot of times, I mean, you've heard this in football, you've heard it in baseball and all of the other sports. some people will rationalize that decision by saying, I'm just leveling the playing field because everybody else is doing it.
Sure.
But not everybody else is in a profession where violence is rewarded, and he is.
Yeah.
And so for him to engage in cheating in a way that can cause more physical damage to another human being, he never thought about that really. You know, it was just about how does he maintain this career that he's worked so hard to build.
Yeah. And then he has the falling out. His cousin Shot is the one who owns the gym. So when Xavier is kind of forced out of the mixed martial arts world to serve this suspension, he starts training at Shot's gym. And these two have really the definitive love-hate relationship. And it seems a lot more like hate. They come to blows, almost come to blows nearly every time they're in a scene together. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship and about Shot?
Yeah, so Shot was probably the most enjoyable character to write in the entire book. Some of him is based a little bit on stories my dad used to tell me about my uncle Shot, who I never met. Yeah, Shot is, he's a complicated guy. He does love his cousin, but he serves as a truth teller for his cousin. And I think I wrote Shot because I feel like we all kind of need a Shot in our life in that sense. That they'll tell you the hard truths, the things that you're not ready to hear, whether you're ready to hear them or not. And that just lent to a lot of fun on the page, because too often, you know, there's been a lot of books about fighting, mostly about boxing, not about mixed martial arts, but that trainer role seems to, it gets a little trite, you know, that it's sort of the same sort of older, wizened kind of sage guy that he's made all the mistakes, and so he's going to guide the fighter the other way. And I like the Shot still making mistakes. He's still screwing up, and he's screwing things up for Xavier.
Sure.
And I just think, you know, again, back to the point about angels, I think that made for more interesting interpersonal relationships between them.
You know, it's dawning on me how much you're writing against type and a stereotype, really. You know, you said you didn't want Xavier to be, you know, kind of the Black character who is pure and innocent and a victim of all these egregious slights that society is throwing at him. He has much more agency than that.
Right.
And when we have a lot of agency, we screw up, and that makes him way more interesting. And then I like what you said about Shot. I couldn't help but think about Clint Eastwood and $1 Million Baby in the corner being like, don't make the same mistakes I did, kid.
Exactly.
You know, that kind of Obi-Wan Kenobi kind of character.
Yep.
And you know, when we see those patterns, and this is another thing, you know, I love talking about the craft of writing. If we can present a reader with an expectation and the reader settles for a moment into the expectation, and then we go, and we turn the expectation, it knocks them, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm engaged with this book. If we continually unsettle their expectations of genre maybe, or characterization, it just makes for a richer reading experience. And you have a character that you want to spend time with, right? Like Shot, you said was fun to write.
Oh my God. But I think when you do that though, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you have to be careful not to veer into gimmick, right? Like
Sure.
not to subvert expectations just to subvert.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
I think there's a fine line with that. Like it's kind of nuanced, and it's almost sort of one of those things where I think you know it if you see it.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't know how to say don't do that.
Sure.
Other than
Yeah.
don't do that.
And that happens a lot. You know, we think our main characters, those are the characters who are carrying the plot on their shoulders. Like Xavier is going to be a pretty straight ahead character. And then we think of our secondary characters like Shot or Sam or the people at the Maple Grove, the nursing home. That's who we can get wild with, because the plot doesn't depend on them. So they can be zany and quirky like Bob Newhart characters. But then you have the danger of them subsuming the personality of the main characters. There is that kind of that fine line there. Another craft thing that I want to talk about, and I want to talk about some of the things in the book, but I want to talk about is process. And I noticed that there are fights in this, but they are not play-by-play fights. They happen fast. You show expertise. You show mastery and then you get out, you know, and you show the effects of the fights on the character. Were you thinking about that when you were writing the book? Like, I don't want to have a 10-page fight scene because it's going to be, it's not like watching a 2-minute fight. A 10-page fight scene takes 15 minutes to read.
Right.
You know, were you thinking about those things?
I was very deliberate about that. And I think some of that comes from, one, my own personal experience with amateur fighting, but also I'm hypercritical of fight scenes in movies, particularly boxing and MMA movies, because they're typically really bad. They're just poorly done. They're over choreographed. They don't smack of any kind of realism. And I didn't want that on the page.
Sure.
That and any action scene in a book, I think, is hard to pull off.
Yeah.
Let alone a fight.
Yeah.
And you know, fights, especially in the mixed martial arts world, they're messy. Like they're not. There's a lot of skill involved, but they're also very chaotic.
Yeah.
So to me, I kind of wanted to recreate that same feeling when people were reading it. It was fast. It happened quickly. Maybe you had to go back and read that sentence because you weren't exactly sure what happened there. Because that's usually what it's like to watch a fight.
Yeah. What I loved in the fight scenes is we never lose sight of Xavier as our anchor point of view. And we're in the moment with him, but he's also predicting what's coming next. He's looking for patterns. He's trying to look at the guy's feet. I think it's Lawrence's feet to see what he's going to do next based on what his feet are doing. And so it's just really cool insight to like what it feels like to be in the ring, something I could never imagine, nor want to experience. But it was really cool psychologically to get a taste of that without having then a roundhouse, then an uppercut, and then he takes him to the mat. You know, like a 3-minute, you know, play by play. I thought that was a really interesting choice. Another really interesting choice. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to read just a little bit, if you don't mind. Just like the opening, I want the audience. I know everybody's read it, but they haven't memorized it. Just to write.
You haven't memorized it?
Just to write here, this to forgetting, but from the beginning to forgetting, just because it's such an awesome example of how compressed narrative summary can teach us so much about a character and a character's mindset from the beginning of the book. And so just buckle in. This is kind of what the book feels like, and it's harrowing.
So the chapter is called "My Mind Playing Tricks on Me," and all the chapter titles, in case anybody didn't pick up on it, are hip hop songs, tracks. So last year he left his groceries in the trunk for 2 days. He'd just gotten the call, a #1 contender fight. After alternating wins and losses, he'd strung together 4 in a row, evading a cut from the roster by the slimmest of margins. The old timer, the journeyman, not a has-been, but it never was. In spite of, no, because of the doubters and their calls to leave his gloves in the middle of the cage. No one would have thought less of him if he'd quit on his own terms. The game had passed Xavier Scarecrow Wallace by. Too many young bucks on the come up looking for a stepping stone to the next level. The cage had no place for old toothless lions fighting for their pride. And then 4 in a row. No tomato cans either. Championship kickboxers, jiu-jitsu aces, each one of the next big thing. But none of them had the grind in them. All talent and hormones. Cardio made cowards of them all. Xavier dragged them into deep waters, the championship rounds, where lactic acid torched muscles, where deep breaths provided no oxygen, only the desperate need to breathe deeper, faster. Shoulders ached. Submissions lacked squeeze, punches lost their snap, kicks sloppy, thrown with languid legs, hinging and pivoting at the joints from sheer momentum. Break the spirit, and the body follows fast behind. But he paid a cost for his time in the deep end too. Worse than the patchwork remnants of stitches in his forehead, worse than the accumulation of crackling scar tissue above his jagged orbital bones, worse even than the seemingly interminable, intensifying headaches. Worse than all that was the forgetting.
That's like 4 paragraphs, maybe less. And it's amazing for the writers out there in the audience and in the virtual world, how much you can do. I mean, just the line 4 in a row, that means 4 fights. Think about what film would have to do on the screen to mean 4 in a row. and just to be able to compress that much information. How did you, was that always going to be your intro? Or did it come after you knew more about him and you were like, I'm just going to tell? And we're so brainwashed by like, show, don't tell.
Right.
No, tell. When you've got a good narrator, a third person narrator, especially tell.
Yeah, I agree. It's so funny you ask about if that was the way I started. So to divert just a little bit from the question, because I think for the writers here, this might hopefully be encouraging. So I threw out the first 15,000 words of this book, just like completely stopped, because my first book had been sort of slotted as a crime novel, which was news to me. Like I had no idea.
That happened to me too.
Yeah, it wasn't the
Yeah.
first one nominated for an Edgar too,
Yeah.
right? So I had no idea I'd written a crime novel. So then when it came time to write the next one, I was like, I guess I write crime novels. So I still had this character who was forgetting stuff, but I wrote like, he had like a body in the trunk of his car and he was like a bag man for some guy. And I got to like the 15,000 words and I was like, excuse my language, but I fucking hate this. Like, I don't like this book at all. So I threw all of it out.
Yeah.
And went back to the character, not the story.
Yeah.
And that beginning came out like water out of a hose. I mean, it just flowed.
It just feels like you know him so well when you're writing that, and you give us a chance to really just get swept up and carried along. And so we get all of that information. So when it's time for the scenes to start, look at how much we already know that we don't have to learn in a scene of a character being like, so Xavier, those last 4 in a row, huh? Like characters don't tell each other things they already know, but we need to know that. So you tell us, right? It's funny what you said about writing a crime. My second novel was nominated for an Edgar, and I didn't know I'd written a crime novel. I was a little embarrassed. I went to the Edgar Awards, and not embarrassed that I had been nominated. I was just embarrassed that I didn't know what to say or do about it. And I was a finalist, and Stephen King was one of the finalists. And we went to the awards, and I was with my agent, editor, and my wife, and some other people. And Stephen King was there, and my agent goes, "Stephen King came. You didn't win, kid." He wouldn't have come otherwise. You didn't win, kid. Enjoy the steak. Have as many drinks as they can let you have. You didn't win.
Get steak?
I don't remember. I don't remember. But what made you decide to write about a fighter struggling with CTE? We hear about that in football so much because football has become kind of America's sport, but we don't hear about it as much, at least the layperson like I am, just casually being aware of MMA. We don't hear about it as much, but my God, of course. Yeah. Of course. In the span of one MMA bout, you're taking 2 seasons worth of hits that a football player takes. Yeah. So what made you decide to write about that?
There were a number of reasons why. So first of all, like boxing was part of the DNA of my house. Growing up, none of us participated in it, but my dad was the guy that had stacks of like those NFL tapes that John Facenda used to narrate, and we used to watch, boxing all the time. I'm the guy, the Hagler, Leonard, of that generation. So I've always loved combat sports. Tuesday nights in college were Tuesday night fights at USA Network when that shit came on. So yeah, so I always loved it. And then as I got into martial arts as a kid, I was also that Karate Kid generation where like that movie came out and like there were Taekwondo schools opening everywhere. But the first class I took, I just got it. And I wasn't an athletic kid, but my body understood martial arts. And not only that, but it was like this place where I didn't have to think about being a mixed race kid. Like, you put on the uniform, everybody's doing sort of the same thing. Like all of those thoughts about like, who are you and what's your identity and all, none of that mattered on that. And so that this combination of feeling like I had an affinity for it physically and what it did for me mentally just made it part of my life. And so to the point where as I got to be an older man, I started training in mixed martial arts, and that I got that even more to the point where I competed as an amateur. but I also, at that time, was also working as a physical therapist.
Yes.
So I did a lot of work in sports medicine. So I saw post-concussive athletes. I worked in temporary, part-time in skilled nursing, worked in home care with dementia and Alzheimer's patients. My wife still works in skilled nursing. So many stories about how people are suffering with that illness when it's not self-inflicted was interesting to me. And I wondered about how do I parallel that with something that I felt like I knew pretty intimately as well, which was the combat sports side of the world. And to your point, we don't talk about it. We barely talk about it in football, like only kind of now.
Yeah.
And it's, to use your words when we were talking earlier, it's a nightmare.
Yeah.
And I felt like this was a story I could tell.
Yeah. Did you, you did jujitsu, right? Is that right?
Jiu-jitsu, and I actually fought once as an amateur in cage.
Oh, wow. So anybody want to hang out with John after this?
I didn't say I was good at it.
In the signing line, step up. Was there anything in particular, I love it when I'm reading a book, and of course I knew that you had been in mixed martial arts, and I knew you'd done physical therapy. And I was looking for little moments, and maybe I found some, but I love it when I'm reading a novel by someone I know and a truth of an experience that I know the author has had is just evident on the page. I'm like, oh, this happened to them. I know them well enough to know this happened to them. But the medical stuff is so well written. And a lot of it is applied to Xavier because he gets injured a lot, and then he injures somebody stunningly early on in the novel. Were there any particular experiences you had? And the follow-up to that is this a conversation people are having within mixed martial arts? Are the fighters talking about, I hope I don't lose my memory. I hope I don't have another concussion.
I wish I could say I could speak for other fighters, but I don't know. I think with any athletes where this is a risk of the sport, it's probably pushed to the side. Like I'm sure it's always back there lingering, but I don't think at the level that some of these people are participating, they can't think about that. Mm-hmm. It's sort of that idea that if you let that thought enter your head, then you might get hurt for real.
Yeah, you're gonna be afraid to get hit.
Yeah. So but to your question about the healthcare side of things, I think the thing that and David Joy and I actually talked about this in our conversation about it, was the treatment of Black female nursing home workers. Mm-hmm. Like that, I felt like a responsibility to put on the page.
Sure, yeah.
Because I can't tell you how many people I had coming up to me at other readings that they were saying that was my dad. Yeah. In the home, and like they never spoke like that when we were growing up. Yeah. And then we saw them in the home.
Yeah, there's a part in the novel where Xavier apologizes to a woman, and she's like, "You think your dad's the only one? Like, you better apologize for everybody if you're going to apologize for him. There's a woman down here who's doing this, and there's an older guy over here who's doing this." But every night I go home and I say, I served as well as I could, and that I did the best job I could today. And these people might not know what they're doing, and that's just kind of what it is. When I first started writing many years ago, I grew up playing sports, obsessed with sports. I still am to a certain degree, but I read a lot of biographies of athletes. And why I loved reading biographies of athletes was I loved reading about people who gave themselves over to something, whether it were Bill Russell, mostly basketball players, Pete Maravich, Clyde Frazier, all the old 70s, 80s, and then eventually Bird, Jordan, Magic, all those people. But then somewhere along the way, I kind of knew in the back of my mind I wanted to write. I began reading biographies of writers. I don't know if there was a athlete biography shelf in our public library in Gastonia, and then there was a writer biography shelf right beside it. And I was like, Bird, Hemingway, I don't know. But what I saw connecting those two pursuits, athletics and art, was discipline. And I'm wondering about your discipline as a physical therapist, as a person with a medical background, as a person who's in martial arts, as a person who's trained, as a person who still trains, and then your writing. Do you see similarities between those two?
No.
Well, then forget it, John. Next question.
No, but I think this is important again for writers in the group. Like, I am the most undisciplined writer. Like, it's really like,
So
and I think it's important to say, because I feel like there's a lot of gatekeeping about, like, you got to be ass and chair every day. You got to be writing every day. Like, that's not me.
Yeah.
And I still managed to write a couple.
Yeah.
You know, it's not about like motivation though, because I think, you know, I do believe in that idea that if you wait for motivation, it's never going to come.
Yeah.
But I'm very much of the mind where reading is writing.
Yes.
Thinking about writing is writing. And I spend a lot of time thinking before I actually sit down and put words to page, mostly because, and maybe this is where the discipline part comes in, but to me, the whole idea of like the vomit draft feels very undisciplined, right?
Yeah.
Like, if I'm going to sit down and write, I'm going to put down the best stuff I can at that time, right? And revise a little bit later, but I want it to feel good when I've written it. I don't want to go, I'm just going to come back to that later.
Yeah.
So I think maybe in that sense, the discipline comes in, but not in, there's no regiment, there's no specific place I got to be sitting. There's no time of day. It's when I'm ready.
That's kind of how I am as well, especially you have two kids. You know, I've got two kids. And so you kind of get it where you kind of get it in where you can get it in when the house is quiet or when you go find a quiet place. So all that to say this, you don't like the Twitter hashtag am writing?
No.
Me. Am writing, y'all. It's like, please stop doing that. That's why I got off Twitter. I was like, I can't look at that anymore.
Now I will never not hear that every time I see that.
Am writing. Am writing in a coffee shop on my typewriter with a beret on. Everybody see me? And I'm the same way, you know, I have what I call it panic work. I'm like, the kids are gone for 2 hours. I don't have a Zoom for 2 hours. The kids are out. I took them to school. I'm going to write for 2 hours.
That's when you write?
And just panic.
Oh, I'm like, turn on TV. Catch up on my shows.
No. I try to get it in those moments of like fueled panic, and it feels urgent. And I try to live in the work as much as I can. And so when I go to bed at night, and that moment when I slip off into dreamland, I try to think about the book. I try to think about the project, because that is the spot in my life where nothing's saying, you suck, that's not a good idea. You know, I'm just living in the creativity. And I try to, when I am in the throes of something like I am now, I try to go to bed the night before excited about the potential of working on something the next day. Like, I'm going to tackle that scene, and I know exactly what the hot thing in that scene is. So I don't dread going to a cold desk, you know, like, oh, don't open this document again. Where to begin? Just scrolling through it. Hate that, you know.
See, I get that on walks with my wife. She's watching that. Because it's unfortunately for her, that's not my time to sound stuff out.
Sure.
And then she'll go, no. And then she'll say something else brilliant. I'll go, oh yeah, and that's when I gotta go back. And I gotta write that down before I forget.
My wife does that too. A lot of the ideas that a lot of turns in novels that have been successful have been from her saying, you know what I've been thinking?
Yeah.
Why don't you make him Luke's father?
No original stories.
Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like being out at the Wilma Dykeman house and what you've been doing during the residency?
Dodging bears.
He texted me one night and he showed me a video of a bear. And I was like, oh, those bears aren't going to bother you. It's the ghost I'd be worried about. And he was like, wait, are you serious? I was like, no, there's no ghost there. My kids have been there. They're weird. They would have sniffed them out. There's no ghost.
No, it's been great. You know, it's I'm discovering I don't mind that isolation so much as I used to, because the isolation during COVID was rough.
Yeah.
Like that was hard. And now I don't know, maybe because it's my choice.
Yeah.
It's been great. And for me, going back to like the reading is writing thing, like this space has been so much better for me to read.
Yeah.
Because I'm a slow reader. And so I need less quiet for writing than I do for reading. And so the next book that I'm hoping to write actually requires more research than anything I've ever done. So it's been great to kind of just have that time to sort of sit and read and then reflect on what I'm reading.
And I know you're going through copy edits of a novel that you're kind of finishing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah,
You feel comfortable?
yeah, because it's got a publication date. So
All right.
June 18th to 2024. Yeah, it's called Devil is Fine. It is about another mixed race character, surprise, who inherits a plantation from the white side of his family. And it was inspired by a trip that my wife and I took to Rehoboth. We go every year in Delaware. And you know, there's so many narratives about the South and slavery and plantations. And I was like, well, you know, that shit was happening in the North too. And I was kind of like, I wonder if it was happening in Delaware. And so I did just a quick Google search, like plantations in Delaware, and there's one on Rehoboth Bay.
Wow.
And not only that, but they discovered 8 bodies on it, 3 of which were West African.
Yeah.
And so that just opened up this whole narrative in my head about like, well, what would it be like if I found out somebody on my side of the family had a plantation? Yeah, it was. Although that story idea hit me about 5 years ago, so it's been kind of in development all this time. But that's the main thrust.
Had you begun after the lights go out when that story arrived? Or
Yep.
did you, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you couldn't let this one go to start
Nope.
that one.
Nope.
Did having that story kind of hovering over your head push you to finish this project because you were eager to jump on to the next one? Or how does that work for you?
No. Interestingly enough, what pushed me to finish this was throwing out that first 15,000, because even though I'm not like the ass and chair write every day guy, I couldn't help it with this one.
Yeah.
Like as soon as I threw that out, the floodgates were open and I was writing probably 1,000 words every day.
That's
Like,
awesome.
I couldn't stop.
That's awesome. Do we have any questions from the audience about being out at the Wilma Dykeman House or writing or any of John's books?
So like, if it's okay, I'll stand. I feel like I have my back. So
Yes, sir. Philadelphia, yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sure, thanks. I have a question because we do a lot of writing for veterans. They're writing for legacies of the Vietnam War and such. And before REM sleep, right, and stream of consciousness, and all of a sudden, it's like I feel I'm brilliant. I mean, it's coming to me, and then it's gone. But you know, sometimes I wake up and I got it. So I was thinking something's going on there, and maybe I need to pay more attention. Because somehow I don't see myself a writer, but something's happening in that particular time of the day for me. So what do you suggest? So I have a paper and pen? Do I have a little, so I can record what's going on in my mind? Or how do I deal with what's going on, and what is that about in terms of?
I don't know what it's about, but I would say pen and pad for sure. Like that's always been great for me. Like even ideas that I don't end up using, if they come to me, I know they're fleeting. Like I know my mind well enough to know that if I don't write it down now, it's gone. So I would say if you are discovering something that gives you that feeling of being a writer, you probably are a writer. And I would, hold on to that.
And you, I know you jokingly said, am I a genius? I would say yes.
Yeah.
You have the genius of your mind is filtering through all these important things, and it's saying, hey, John, remember this, this is important. It's just rattling around the inside of your brain because it's important. And, there is the fear that if you don't write things down, when they come to you, they're going to be gone forever. And sometimes what will happen for me is something will come to me and I'll write it down. And the glory of what's in my mind looks so piddly and ridiculous on the little page. I'm like, oh man, yeah, I'm a failure. So, back to the cage I go. Taking up my career in mixed martial arts. But here's the thing is that our brains are incredible computers and all of that stuff is there. And so we just have to find a way to create space, whether it's when we go to bed at night or when we get up first thing in the morning, or when we're out walking, or when we're driving, or if we're just kind of sitting alone and being quiet, we have to train our minds to create the space to access those kinds of memories and those kind of impulses, because they're there, they're wanting to get out. And what I see now a lot of the time is like streaming, like we have access to more film, more content than ever before. And it is almost tricking us into believing we're not creative, because we're just taking all of this stuff in, we're not putting any out. And we're all walking around so bottled up with all these great stories in our minds. And you can't teach that. Like when I teach, I tell students, I can teach you how to write dialogue, I can teach you how to format a narrative, but I can't teach you where creativity comes from. Like if you've got that, then get in a class and find out how to format dialogue, find out how to structure a narrative. Because what you'll find is if you create these little spaces, the stuff will come out in film. It'll when you create a space for it, it'll come, it'll be there. But it's just finding the time and the physical and emotional space to literally create those spaces, whether it's a writing group or a university class or Great Smokies here in Asheville, the writing classes the university offers, the community writing classes. They do memoir classes all the time. They're great tools out there. And I think you were going to ask something.
That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, you mentioned, oh, by the way, I'm not one of the many people here who've read your book. Not read it yet, sorry.
He came in on the strength of the titles.
Yeah, just on the title alone, right. So my question comes with that level of ignorance as a backdrop. If I heard correctly, you mentioned that the father-in-law has Alzheimer's?
No, it's father.
His father has Alzheimer's. Okay, great. And what degree in the interplay between referencing him within the context of his father and trying to understand his father's form of dementia, how does that inform him about his own evolving dementia? And the reason I ask is because most people, well, hell, not just most patients, most physicians don't know what's going on for quite some time until you get several, examinations, several experiences. Right. You can say, it's not one of these 1,000 possible things. This shapeshifter is probably that.
Right.
And so I'm wondering how he uses that, almost like the way you said about the orphan situation. How does this give him informative context?
So how do I answer this without giving away too much? I mean,
You say you didn't buy the book, screw
no. Part of the way I frankly get around that is that you're dropped into sort of the middle of this, right? And he only, in recollecting things that have happened between him and his mother, does he see that there were hints to this all along? Not only the Alzheimer's coming on, but this sort of revelation that his father was in fact racist, even though he has a black son. So it's less about trying to figure out when these things were happening and how it happened, but it's more of a reflection for him about this may be where I'm heading, even though our types of dementia are different in terms of their origin. He's seeing himself in the mirror in his father, and it's scaring the shit out of him.
And he's having things happen like going to sleep in strange places, right. Leaving his groceries in the car, having some really horrifying misfortunes with an adopted animal that he just can't, and he has trouble wondering what's real and what's not, and what's a dream, and he's splitting headaches, and it's intense. It's intense.
Did that answer your question? Because I'm not sure if I did.
Pardon.
Okay.
Thanks.
Jim, yeah.
Yeah, Mother used to say that everybody wants to write a great novel, and what you need for a great novel, a necessary condition, is a good plot. You got to plot it. Things have to happen. It's got to be engaging. But the sufficient thing, the necessary and sufficient thing, is a great character. If you don't have one or more great characters, you don't have a great novel, no matter how good your plot is. So both of you all are really good at interior lines of character, bringing characters not just alive, but and doing things, but just fully fleshed out with interior lives. How do you do that?
I don't know. I think about, for me, there are really 5 components. I'm simplifying things, but one of the components to characterization that I really like is interiority. I really like getting in there and having the character think. And, I had a novel called The Last Ballad, came out several years ago. And every time a new character is introduced, I made it a point that they were static. They were not moving through space. They were sitting and they were thinking. And I wanted the reader to be kind of overwhelmed by the avalanche of their like thinkingness and their like kind of disconnected thoughts and kind of how that was going to titrate into some kind of narrative. Because that's how we live, we sit and we think, and our thoughts are disparate and they don't necessarily match. But in some way, a narrative comes to life from that. And so what I also like to do, I like to do that, but I also like to get in and just dig with characters, complications, mistakes. How do characters intersect with one another? How do they disappoint one another? How do they rely on one another? And the more I can do that, the richer the experience of writing becomes for me. Because, I don't write quick books. I've published 4 novels in 10 years or so. And so it takes me kind of a long time to do it. So I've got to have some kind of mystery at the desk with these characters that I'm creating. I've got to not always know all of their impulses or understand all of their desires.
I think for me it's similar, but I also I did some work in like the marketing world for a little while, and there's this thing that you create personas, right? Where you have to essentially, instead of just sort of coming up with this blanket audience of people that you're trying to sell this certain thing to, you create one character, one person, give them a name, what their job is, are they married, all these other things. And I try to sort of do the same thing about a character before I even sat down to write. Like, I want to know them inside and out. And then I sort of apply to that kind of one of the best pieces of writing advice I think I ever got, which was I think about what it is they want. And then I think about how they're going to get in their own way to get it. Like, not just what outside forces are going to do to stop them from getting it, but how are they going to mess it up? That to me creates some of the most interesting characters.
Yeah, because the novels that John and I are writing, or at least the novels that I'm trying to write, are the plot comes from what the character wants and what's in the way of that desire. It's not a character is living and then like the Russians invade, or there's like a terrible snowstorm, or everybody gets cancer.
Isn't that the next one?
That's the next one.
Oh,
It's
okay.
called Cancer Snowstorm. Russian Cancer Snowstorm. And so we're trying to get in there and really meddle in the interior lives of these characters and see kind of what blooms from all of their complications.
Yeah. What was it? Vonnegut said, put your character up a tree and then throw rocks at him.
Yeah,
And see how he's going to get out.
yeah. You were going to ask in the hat.
Oh,
Yes, and then the woman behind you next.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to say, I'm relatively new to the Asheville area. I've only been to a few book events, but I think this has been the best one that I've come to.
Thank you.
The author events, because like great, ideas and great interaction. Can I be friends with both of you?
That's really the only reason I do stuff like this, is to make friends.
I feel like that was a mic drop. Like, we're done. That's it.
we're gonna sign books down.
And we're done.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Well, it's hard to follow that. There seems to be like an increasing trend for series, and I understand the psychological benefits for the reader and the monetary, benefit to the writer. I wonder whether in any of your books you have a character or characters, whether they're primary or secondary characters, that you've ever thought that you want to explore more and maybe take out into a new novel.
Not really, not for me. When I think of series, I think more of like a genre, like science fiction series, like what Marlon, his name's falling out of my head, with the science fiction.
Talking about Marlon James.
Yeah, Marlon James.
Yes.
He did the science fiction series. He's a literary writer, but he's like, I'm going to write a science fiction series. And I've just never thought about it that way, or like James Lee Burke or Craig Johnson writing the Longmire series. You got to really love a character to stick with them for that long. And I know Craig does love that character enough to stick with him for that long. I've had some characters kind of in the novel that I'm working on now. There's a character from a previous novel who appears, but it's just like what I'm interested in doing now is I'm writing about North Carolina, and I'm thinking I'm writing about the coast, I'm writing about the Piedmont, I'm writing about the mountains. Like, let's just have some of the same people show up and show, kind of sew the state up a little bit and make it feel like a real place. And that's really my impulse there. Not to explore a character anymore in depth necessarily.
Well, and the setting is your recurring character.
Sure, the setting is my recurring character. That's my series is North Carolina.
No, I've thought about revisiting the father from my first book, but not in a series sense, but just sort of what happened years later after, I think Paul Harding did that with Enon and then Tinkers,
Yeah.
which, those weren't series, but they were, a continuation. It's sort of a nuanced difference, I guess. But so I've had thoughts about that, but no, as far as series in general, I don't know. I feel like I got to get in and out, and I don't want to think about it anymore.
Yeah.
I don't. Yeah.
You were going to ask, ma'am? Yes.
Well, I'm just wondering if, you're considering this is your niche, that you're gonna always write about, mixed race issues and also from the Black point of view.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, yes. Yeah, I will. And maybe not always about mixed race identity per se, but I don't know. I don't think there's enough of us getting our stories out there. So I'm gonna keep doing it.
Yeah, write what you know or write what you can find out. Are there any questions online? Yeah, Ann.
Question for John. I just wonder what your kids think about your writing.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't.
I wouldn't let my kids read this book.
Not kid appropriate yet.
No, but I mean, which is the fact that you spend a lot of time doing it and researching it.
Oh, it's when I've shown them my book, they're like, cool. No, it's not quite they're at their level of I don't want to say comprehension, it's more interest. Yeah, they just they know daddy writes and that he gets to be home with them, which is a cool perk. So that's about as good as it gets.
That's kind of what my kids are the same. I know that question was for John, but I told my my girls, I said, I'm going up to Asheville. I'm gonna do an event with John, and y'all met him not long ago. And I turned the book over, and they just like looked at this picture, and they're like, oh yeah, we met him in Spartanburg. For them, like it's like normal to like meet writers. They're like, oh, a guy's on a book. Yeah, I know him. Yeah, whatever, no big deal. So it's like any other job to them, which is kind of cool because that's what it feels like most of the time. When your hobby becomes your job, it's very much your job.
Yep.
It's very much your job. Are there any questions online?
We don't have any questions online, so we're almost at the top of the hour. We can take one more before we get a signing, or folks can ask questions in the signing. Is there anything? Yep. Yeah, definitely, Ellen. That's a question.
Sorry, I didn't want to take up time.
Especially, I mean, you got a call out earlier, so you got a question.
I was just curious, and this is actually a softball, John.
Oh, nice. I love softballs.
Yeah, so it's been a fun night. Thank you both. But Wiley was your teacher, and several years ago,
Mhm.
and it's a cool little thing. I'm just wondering if you learned anything really important that stuck with you from Wiley
Oh, yeah.
himself.
Yeah, no, I got a few pearls from him. I told him earlier, but I'm happy to share this with other folks. So, and I might embarrass you a little bit too, but so Wiley taught at the Mountain View MFA where I was a student, and I tried desperately to get to be his like mentee, but knowing Wiley, there was a line out the door for that. So I never got that opportunity, but I did get to be in a workshop with him, which probably was one of the most formative workshops I had for my first book. And it was because he gave like one of the best pieces of advice that it took the direction of my first book and made it take a hard right, which I was writing about a character who was mixed race but didn't know. and had a friend who had come out of prison who had been converted to neo-Nazism in jail. And so, you know, I turned in this piece and Wiley was tearing it apart. I mean, he was giving really good feedback. And then he just asked a really great question. He said, what if he does know he's mixed? And it took the story in a completely different direction, just with just sort of that simple idea about throwing that complication in there, like take away the innocence of him in this, and it opened that up. And it's that piece of advice is I've been able to spread that out over everything else I've ever written, because if I'm on a certain trajectory, I go, well, yeah, but maybe what if they do this? And it's been one of the most helpful things. You taught me.
Well, thank you. Yeah, when we were going through the applications, I knew a lot of the people who had applied, but of course I knew John. I was like, I'm not gonna tell anybody that I know John. And so the selection committee met, and they were like, okay, and I had emailed them and said, okay, let's just all come with our top 5. And then we'll all come with our top 3. I'm sorry, we'll all come with our top 3, and we'll just share at the top of our time together who our 1, 2, and 3 are. And John was like number 1 and 4 out of the 5. And I was like, oh, thank God. Because he was number 1 on mine as well. And so we just talked and we just like, you know, then we were like, well, maybe not. We kept talking. And then by the end of the hour, we're like, it's John Vercher. And I was like, I know him. But it was quite wonderful. And I'm not one bit surprised any of this has happened for John. And you know, you had quite a few buddies in that cohort of writers, Scott and Ted and Nadia just before you, who published some really great books. To be part of something like that is pretty spectacular. So, well, thank you all for such a great evening. And John's going to hang out and sign books and take questions. But thank you so much for coming.